So if you wanted to do brushes in Photoshop, let's see, I had a pre-made thing. Where'd it go? Aha, there we go. We'll work on these two different things. So you know you got your brushes up here, and these are just kind of the predefined default type of brushes. For now, I've only used just the round ones because they're the easiest to learn with as far as changing your size and opacity, and they paint off roundedly. There are some default textured brushes, and with these, if you haven't played around with them yet, in one click you get kind of, let's use black. You get an idea of the type of texture that you can use with it. And if you click and drag, you know this is what it works with. With
I
these,
love texture brushes.
yeah,
I use them a lot.
they if you want to add, say, texture to the fruit, they almost kind of work like a stamp. You can click multiple times, and then you start really building up that type of texture. So if I was to say I wanted to add a lot of texture to my little pear right here, let's go to that particular layer. By the way, I had over 20 different layers that I was working on. But if I wanted to add that type of texture, you know, pick up the color and then maybe hit it a little bit. Try not to drag. You know, you would want to do this with your mouse rather than your pen, because your pen will tend to drag it. But very lightly, just a few places you would hit can add a little bit of texture to what you're working on. That type of way. If you're doing a painting of a person, you can get these texture brushes and use it for skin type texture. This is a great way of blending different things so they don't look so plasticky and unreal. If you ever do photo touch-ups and photo restoration, I use these brushes a lot to do the restorations to work with. You can download a lot of brushes. If you go to just do a Google search for Photoshop brushes, you can get ones that other people use, but you have to be careful with these. For instance, Brusheezy is probably one of the more popular websites that'll come up where you can download Photoshop brushes and patterns to work with. So for instance, this is a Christmas tree brushes, and with these you download them. Another one was, these are Planet texture brushes, so these are other textures to work with. There's a problem I have with these though. I'll erase this away. I went ahead and downloaded these two type of brushes, and when you do download them, a brush file, I'll open these both up, ends in ABR, so Adobe Brush Resource. So here's the Planet brushes, and here's these. If you wanted to load them up, just double click, and it looks like nothing happened, but if you go back up to your brushes palette, they've been added on down here to the bottom. So here are all those Planet brush textures. Let's add in the Christmas tree brush textures. Double click. It'll open up in Photoshop, so now if I go down to the bottom, hey, there's all my Christmas trees that I can pull from. Let's see what these look like. Never used them before. Ooh, that's a big brush. So with this one, let's get a darker color, we can see it. Yeah. You basically click around, add your brushes, kind of like a cookie cutter, kind of like a stamp. You can change the size of them and use them from there. It's a little bit boring. You can't do too much with it in the way of painting and with them. Same way with these Planet texture type brushes. It's really just kind of a one-click type of deal. You click it, now you got the texture to work with. You can change the size of it, and that is good. But if you tried to add these textures, you can see where when it overlaps, it just gets darker working in there. Instead, let me show you where you can get some good professional quality brushes. There's a great, he actually works for Disney and he does concept art for Disney, chrisoatley.com. If you sign up for his newsletter, he sends you the brushes that he uses whenever he works on his type of work. Tell you what, let's see some of his digital paintings. Like I said, he does a lot of concept type art. All this is completely digital. And he does little videos and he talks about different things that he does and where he gets his inspiration from. So I'll post a link to his type of work as well. But he sends you his brushes that he uses. And in this case, they're not necessarily on ABR, it's a TPL. I think it's just tool preset something. Same thing, it works just like a brush. So let's pull these up. Where are they? Did that open? Oh no, they didn't load up. Okay. For his, however, his work more like this. They obviously didn't load. I'll have to look and see why. But his are a little bit more dynamic in that they'll change shapes and they'll change even sometimes color and texture. Here's an example of a predefined dynamic brush. These two, I'll use this one. This one tends to mimic the look of fur. Watch what happens when I click and drag with this one. I've got red loaded up, and let's make it larger. So there we go. A lot bigger. So when I click and drag with it now, you see how it's changing its color, it's changing the position. So very, very quickly, hey, I can paint the same thing over and over again and create almost like a fur type thing. This really comes in handy when you're trying to cover an entire area. Let's see if this one's more dynamic. Nope, this one's not dynamic. It's painting the same thing over and over again. So how do you do this? How do you create a brush that will respond to what you're doing? Let's take, I'll tell you what, let's take this brush. I'll even get rid of the circles so we can see what we're working with. So if I use this brush, by default, when I click and drag, this is what it looks like. It's spaced out like this, and it's just kind of daubing it along almost like if it was a sponge over and over again. To open up your brush presets, click on this icon, and here's the palette off to the side. The first thing, by default, you can of course change the size of it, larger or smaller, and you can change the angle that it's at. And especially if you have a round brush, you can move that around. So now, that same brush that I had, it's squeezed together and it's off at a different angle. That's pretty cool. I can bring it back out. And you kind of get an idea of what it looks like down here as well. So I can always rotate the angle of my brush or the up and down side of it. To get it to be closer or further apart, change the spacing of it. So right now it's at 75%. If I bring it closer together, when I paint, I'll get something that's more like this. So if you ever especially have a round brush, and that round brush is doing something that looks like this, check out your spacing. Bring the spacing closer together, and you'll get a lot smoother type line. Let's go back to our texture brush that we're working with. So with this one, predefined as that one, let's bring the spacing in just a little bit more. So now that's something a little bit better. Let's see if I can do much better. Now we'll start playing around with these predefined things. The shape dynamics are what I change up the most. And these allow you to change the size of it, the angle of it, and the amount that it changed is called the jitter. So let's pull this up. So the amount of size difference will alter by 48%. And you can see what it kind of looks like down here. So now if I was to click and drag, you can see how it's getting, let's make it a little bit better, larger and smaller. So now if I click large and small, I no longer have a solid size brush. It randomly changes the size of it. And I can adjust the minimum amount. You can even control it based on your pen pressure. So if I wanted it to be a little bit more random, that's one way of doing that. Another thing is change the angle of it. So now it'll automatically rotate differently based on the angle. So now I've gone from having a simple brush that way to quickly having a textured brush that creates something like that. And the roundness, will it be thicker or thinner? It'll look more like this. So if I was painting a landscape and I wanted it to look like paint daubs or paint brushes, very, very quickly I've created the texture of it working with that. Pretty cool? Okay. Here's the next cool one that I use a lot, scattering. Right now if I was to click and drag, well, I turn scattering on, but you can let it move across, scatter outward by a certain percentage. If I back up, you can see there's low scattering, there's more scattering. So it'll move everything away from you. So now I get something that looks a little bit more like this. Very easy, very, very cool. So you can imagine if you had a brush that looked like a leaf or something, and you wanted to quickly fill in a tree with all those leaves, different size leaves, different rotations of a leaf. This is one quick way of doing that. And you can change the count of it. You know, if you want more for it to, I'll bring the count up so it very quickly has a bunch more than I'm having to draw in with that one. The texture, we'll click on this. You can add, don't forget to click on the name. If you have a predefined texture, you can incorporate that into there. So if I wanted these bubbles to be a part of it, it's not going to show up too well, but that's one way of just adding a little bit more. You can kind of see the little bubble texture repeating itself in there. That's one way of doing it. I rarely use the texture. Dual brush, if you want to have more than one brush working at the same time. So in this case, I've got the scatter brush and also this kind of cloud type brush. It will do both of them. The main thing about setting up your own brushes is that it's a lot of playing around to get exactly what you want. Another great one is called the color dynamics. This is where I can, instead of just being purple, I can get a little bit lighter or darker, or let's do a hue and saturation. So now when I click, you can see it's changing up the color and also the lightness and darkness, all within that same brush. And you can play around with the transfer and different things. The most often ones that I've used are just the shape dynamics, the scattering, and the color dynamics, simply because when you're doing painting, you're not really worried about texture. You create the texture. You're not worried about dual brushes. You're just wanting to get a little bit more control. So if I had to go back to my this particular type texture, let's see if I can make it to where I can use it. Let's see. I'll pick this red. I'll just click and drag. Well, not too much. Let's see if I can get my color dynamics to change up. The hue, of course, is how much different. The saturation, maybe I want to get a little bit more or less saturated. And we'll keep the brightness, purity more or less. So now if I was to paint on here, there we go. Now I'm getting more of a paint daub type of effect. I can click here, start adding it in. And this is starting to look a little bit more painterly. It's kind of fun. And it just adds a little bit of randomness to whatever you're working with. I can, of course, drop my opacity and let it blend in a little bit better. And the more I work over it, the easier it gets. And I'm holding down my Option key and just selecting the different areas. So now I've gone from an almost realistic type painting to a painterly type painting, just by changing up my brush dynamics. Here's how to make a brush. Here's the funnest thing in the world that you can ever do in Photoshop. First of all, you have to start off with some sort of pixels, preferably in just black and white. So I'm just going to make, I'll just use my paintbrush and draw off a simple line or simple little pattern. So if I drew this off, that's good. So something like this. You can adjust your opacity, get a little bit down. So whatever image that you have, so if it's an image of a leaf, if it's an image of a texture, you can work with this. Use your selection tool to select the area, okay? And then go to Edit and down to Define Brush Preset, okay? With Define Brush, it's going to ask you to give it a name. I'll just keep it as a sample brush, and you can see what my brush is going to look like. So when I say OK, I'll deselect it. It's going to be a huge brush, because when I started it was huge. choose my paintbrush, and it's been added now to the end of my brushes that I'm working with. So now I can actually click and paint with that particular type of brush. Let's bring up the opacity of it. It's been defined as a brush. So what can you really do with that? Here's what I like to do. If you go to Google and you want a particular texture, so for your painting you have that vase texture, it's almost like a concrete type texture. Or if you wanted to add, in my case I was looking up fur textures. Find an image of some fur, the type of textured fur that you want. And so if I was painting an animal, maybe I'd want to add this kind of fur. Let's download it really quickly. Come on. I bet this is a huge image and it's taken forever to load up. Oh, there it is. So this is a cat fur type image. Yeah. I'm going to scale it down just a little bit so it doesn't, yeah, because that's a huge file. We'll make it 3 by or 2 by whatever. Now it's almost too small. Make a selection of the area. Even though it's not black and white, it still has a good contrast to it. And then go to image, or excuse me, edit, define brush, and this is what my brush is going to look like. We'll say OK, and now I can start painting with that particular brush as well. Go in and define your presets, so maybe I want it to have a little bit more of a size jitter, maybe I want it to scatter a little bit more, drop my opacity, and I can start painting in that particular texture. Another thing to pay attention to is you can go in here and do an adjustment of the levels of it so it has a little bit more contrast. I want it to be lighter or darker. And I can work with that. It's still not perfect, however. Why do you think it's not perfect?
Still a stamp.
It's still a stamp. There's no way of evenly blending it. Here's the fun part. Instead of just making a selection, so I make a marquee selection of the area. What I want to do is feather the edges of this so that the edges aren't so harsh on that one. With it selected, you can go up to select, and then we're going to modify. Where is it? Well, border. Why isn't it working? I've got it selected. Usually it lets me feather my edge. I tell you what, I think I know why. If it doesn't let you do it, you can always type in a feathered edge up here. So let's give it maybe 10 pixels. So when I make a selection now, there it is. You can see it's got a curved edge. Watch what happens when I define the brush. Edit, define the brush. You can almost see it on this side. It's feathering out that little edge. Let's see what that one looks like. So if I was to use the new brush, well, it still didn't do it. Tell you what, let's back up. Make it a little bit darker. Supposed to be able to do a selection, go to select, modify. Hey, it's letting me do it now. Now we're going to feather the edge of it. We'll make it even larger radius, 50 pixels. If I was to delete, oops, and fill it in with white, this is what the feathered edge looks like. You see how it's completely feathered out? That's really what I'm going for. So edit, and see if it'll work this time. Define brush, much better. We'll say OK. Too big. So now instead of having a hard edge, it's got a softer edge, and I can click through it and it will blend together a lot better than the other one did, even if I overlap it just a little bit. If I had to redo those planet textures, so let's use this planet texture, and it's a huge brush. I would click once. Well, oh, I know why. I'm the wrong layer. Click once and actually define the edge of it. Then I would make a selection of it. Got it selected. Actually got feather turned on, but we'll feather the edge again. Feather it, let's do 20 pixels. And that would define the brush again. Edit, define brush. Let's paint with that new brush now. It didn't do it. Best laid plans of whatever I work on. Sometimes they don't work. All else fails. All else fails. We're just going to paint off the edges of this with white. I'll use a regular brush. I'll manually feather it. I'm going to make this work. There we go. This would fade a lot better. Now let's make a selection. Select it.
Will you try to add this to your pair and show us how you can get that to blend in well with the surface or with the texture?
Yes, yes, I'll do that. I'll tell you what, I'll define this brush and I'll add this texture to it. Now that I've defined it, now it should work. There it is. So now I can easily blend that in. See how I can overlap it? Much better than it was before. So if I wanted to add this texture to my pear, ooh, I've made a mess of my pear. Tell you what, I'm going to close this out and open it back up so I can get my pear back. So if I wanted to add this texture to my pear, I would make another layer on top of wherever the pear layer is. There it is. Oops. Another clipping mask. I could click on top of it. You can see it's blending well into it. Still doesn't look perfect, but if I change my blending mode from normal to multiply or to even overlay, may work a little bit better. It'll slowly blend in that texture. I think multiply would be my best option. I could even change the color of it. If you had a cement type texture, so you're doing yours for that one, I would do a cement texture. There we go. So this looks like the surface of your base that you're working on. Let's try that one. I would click on it. Find the texture that you want. Load it up. Make a selection. Go up to select and feather the edge of it. And the amount you feather, it's going to really depend. I just did it 50%. And then define that brush. So you can see it's got a feathered edge. Then with it defined, you can go, don't save it, back into here and start using it. So now I can add that texture in to what I'm working with. Very quickly, very easily that way. All cool?
Mm-hmm. So how would you then be able to get to all the contour, the shape of the pear?
You would just adjust the amount that it used. So maybe I would just add the texture on not a light area or too much of a dark area, and you would build it up very, very, very subtly. You really wouldn't follow the contour. You would just add it more to one area and less to the other. So let's say I'd build it up. Of course, I'm actually using a darker area. This is probably not the best way of doing it. You wouldn't want to click and drag. I wouldn't do it. But you would start off very small and just gradually fade it into there. We'll work with yours specifically to get it to work on there. But this is just a quick and easy way of just adding a quick idea of texture to what you're working on. In this case, for here. If I did use a different color, I bet it would blend a little bit better. Let's make a new layer to work on. So if I used, so now I'm using the orange, and we'll multiply that into there, and so now it blends a little bit of the orange into that. It's something to play around with, but that's how you can make your own brushes, your own textures to work with as well. This also works with your smudge tool. So if you want to smudge an area or get it to, well, I'm not on the right one, to jump around a little more instead of evenly blending it, play around with your brush presets, especially the size of it and the scattering of it, and it will smudge and scatter also. So you get a little bit of a texture with that. Actually, I've never tried scattering with the smudge tool, so let's see what that looks like. You can see how it's going to...
So you can change the presets of the smudge?
Yep, you can change if it's any type of brush, you can change the presets of it. So if I wanted to smudge that, you can see now it's really
Very cool.
looking a lot more painterly. And it's going very, very quickly. It's actually not bad at all. I'm going to have to do that a little bit more. I gave you all a PDF on some painting techniques, and this is what that guy used in one of the pages of the PDF.
With scattering the blend?
Yeah,
Smudge brush?
use your smudge brush and use some scattering on it to give it that type of effect as well. Have you ever done that before, Nicole? Nicola?
No, sir.
I'm learning your name. Nicola.
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 It's not that hard.
Okay. That was all for today. I'll turn off recording.